What if your parents put you on a train, knowing they might never see you again? The year is 1939. In a crowded station in Prague, the air is filled with fear, confusion, and hurried goodbyes. Parents cling to their children, whispering last words of hope, their voices trembling as they urge them to be brave. Some mothers press small toys into tiny hands. Others pin handwritten notes to coats, praying that someone in a foreign land will know their child's name. Among them is a 6-year-old boy named Alf. He does not fully understand what is happening, but he feels the weight of his father's hand as it lets go, the trembling of his mother's voice as she tells him everything will be all right. In that moment, a decision has been made that will shape his entire life, to step onto the Kindertransport. The Kindertransport, literally children's transport, was a rescue mission unlike any other. Between December 1938 and the outbreak of war in September 1939, around 10,000 Jewish children from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia and Poland were evacuated to safety in Britain. It was not governments who carried the greatest burden of this effort, but civilians, teachers, social workers, foster families, religious groups, and ordinary citizens who opened their homes. The trains offered a fragile lifeline. Parents were not allowed to accompany their children. Each departure was a gamble with fate: save the child by sending them away, or risk losing them by keeping the family together. For Alf Dubs, the train journey began with tears and ended in silence. He sat with other children, some crying, some too stunned to speak. Outside the window, the familiar landscapes of home blurred into foreign fields. At 6 years old, he did not know that he would never again see the father who placed him on that train. For the adults left behind, this parting was unbearable. Yet they believed that somewhere in Britain, strangers would take their children in and give them the chance to live. As the train rattled through Europe, danger grew with each border crossed. Guards inspected papers, strangers asked questions, and the fear of being turned back was real. For the children, it was a blur of motion, stations, faces, the smell of coal and iron. For some, the final goodbye came with a kiss on the cheek. For others, it was a hurried push through the door before the whistle blew. Many carried only a small suitcase, a label around the neck, and memories that would haunt them for decades. When Alf arrived in Britain, he stepped into a world he had never seen before. London was foreign, the language unfamiliar, the people strangers. But there was safety. There were volunteers waiting on the platform, calling out names, matching children to foster families. Imagine being 6 years old and trying to understand that your parents had trusted you to the kindness of people you had never met. That is what thousands of children experienced through the Kindertransport. Britain in 1939 was on the edge of war. Civilians were already bracing for bombing raids, rationing, and the uncertainties of conflict. Yet despite this, ordinary people agreed to open their homes to refugee children. Some were welcomed into warm and loving families. Others found themselves in cold houses, where they were treated more as burdens than as guests. For Alf, the journey of survival had only just begun. The story of the Kindertransport was not a tale of a single hero, but of a collective effort. British citizens donated money, lobbied their government, and volunteered time to organize safe passage. Civil servants worked through nights to process visas, while local committees arranged lodging. In synagogues, churches, and community halls, volunteers prepared beds and meals for children who would arrive with nothing. Without this civilian network, the trains would have carried children to nowhere. Instead, they carried them to life. For the children themselves, life in Britain was a mixture of safety and loss. Safety because they were out of reach of the Nazi terror. Loss because most would never see their parents again. Every letter that arrived from Europe was treasured, every silence dreaded. For Alf, the absence of his father became a permanent part of his identity. His survival was marked not only by gratitude, but by a deep understanding of what had been left behind. At school, he struggled with the language. At play, he learned the ways of a new culture. The war soon surrounded Britain, with blackouts, air raid sirens, and bomb shelters becoming a part of daily life. Yet even as the world was at war, the Kindertransport children carried their own silent battles inside them, the memory of separation, the fear of loss, and the uncertainty of belonging. This first chapter of Alf's life is not only his story, but also the story of thousands of children who stepped off trains in London, Liverpool, Harwich, and other cities across Britain. They were not soldiers, not politicians, but children, civilians whose lives were torn apart by a conflict they could not understand. And yet, their survival carried within it the seeds of future voices. Voices that would one day speak out not just for themselves, but for generations to come, because survival was never the end of their journey. For Alf, and for many like him, survival was the beginning of a lifelong duty to remember, to speak, and to ensure that the compassion shown by strangers in 1939 would never be forgotten. When Alf arrived in Britain, the war had not yet begun, but the shadows of conflict already loomed. The children from the Kindertransport were sent to foster homes, hostels, and schools across the country. For many, this new life was a patchwork of kindness, confusion, and homesickness. They carried their labels like silent reminders, each one marked as a refugee, each one a stranger in a strange land. Alf's earliest days in Britain were defined by uncertainty. Everything was unfamiliar, the food, the language, even the rhythm of daily life. At 6 years old, he tried to make sense of classrooms where he understood almost nothing that was said. Teachers were patient, but the barrier of language made him feel alone. Yet as children do, he adapted. Slowly, words became less foreign. Games in the playground became bridges across cultures, and behind every smile or gesture of welcome, there was the possibility of belonging. For children like Alf, the question was never simply about safety. It was about identity. Who was he now? A boy from Prague, a refugee, a guest in a foreign family's home. Some Kindertransport children were taken in by warm, loving households that embraced them as their own. Others were placed with families who saw them as outsiders, or worse, as burdens. The experiences varied widely, and the memories shaped their lives forever. Alf was one of the fortunate ones. He found people who cared for him and ensured he could continue his schooling. Yet, even in safety, there was always the ache of absence. Letters from Europe came sporadically, censored and delayed. Each envelope carried hope and dread. For many Kinder children, those letters eventually stopped coming. When they did, the silence spoke louder than words. It was the silence of loss. As the war erupted in September 1939, Britain itself became a battleground. Bombs rained down on cities during the Blitz, and Alf, like millions of others, experienced the sound of air raid sirens, the hurried rush to shelters, and the unease of nights spent underground. For a refugee child who had already been torn from his home, the war in Britain added another layer of fear. Yet there was also resilience. British civilians shared their struggles with the refugees. In the blackout streets, in the queues for rations, there was a common spirit of endurance. School became a refuge of a different kind. Education offered structure, routine, and a sense of normalcy. For Alf, learning English was more than survival. It was a way of building a new self. Language became the bridge between past and present. It gave him the ability to connect with classmates, to understand the news on the radio, to read books that opened new worlds. Each new word was a step toward belonging. Still, there was no escaping the fact that his family was far away, trapped in a continent descending into darkness. The separation was not temporary. It was permanent. For many Kinder children, including Alf, the painful truth was that their parents would not survive the Holocaust. This knowledge did not come all at once, but settled slowly, like a shadow over the years. The train ride that saved their lives had also been the last goodbye, but children are resilient, and Alf grew within this new world. He absorbed British customs, adopted new routines, and began to feel the stirrings of identity as both a refugee and a future citizen of Britain. The war years shaped him, but so did the kindness of those who sheltered him. Every act of compassion, from a teacher, a foster parent, or a neighbor, planted seeds that would later define his outlook on life. By the time the war ended in 1945, Alf was no longer the boy who had stepped nervously off a train with a label around his neck. He was a teenager, molded by both trauma and opportunity. The Britain that had taken him in was battered by war, but determined to rebuild. And for Alf, the question of who he was and what his future would hold was about to unfold in unexpected ways. What made the Kindertransport unique was not only the rescue itself, but the stories that followed. These children did not remain silent victims of history. They grew up to become teachers, doctors, artists, activists, and voices of memory. Their journeys were diverse, but each carried the imprint of that train ride and the loss it represented. For Alf, survival was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of a lifelong duty, to give meaning to the sacrifice his parents had made, and to honor the kindness of strangers who gave him a chance to live. The Second World War had reshaped him, but it had also given him a new home. Britain was not just a place of refuge. It became the country where Alf would grow, study, and eventually serve. His path would not be ordinary, because his childhood had been anything but ordinary. This is where the quiet resilience of a refugee boy began to transform into the determined voice of a man who would one day speak out for others. As the war ended in 1945, Europe was in ruins. Millions were displaced, families torn apart, cities reduced to rubble. For Britain, victory brought relief, but also the immense task of rebuilding. For Alf, now a teenager, the end of the war marked the beginning of a new chapter, growing into adulthood in a land that had given him refuge, but was still not truly home. The trauma of separation never left him. Like many Kindertransport children, he carried a heavy silence about his parents. His father had perished during the Holocaust, and the loss was not just personal. It was part of a collective tragedy that claimed 6 million Jewish lives. Yet Alf did not allow grief to silence him. Instead, it became a quiet fire that would guide his choices for the rest of his life. As he pursued his education, Alf discovered the power of ideas. Books opened doors, giving him access to history, philosophy, and politics. For a boy who had once struggled to understand a single word of English, he now found strength in using language to understand the world. Words, once foreign, became his tools, and with them came a growing sense of responsibility. Britain in the post-war years was not an easy place. Food remained rationed into the early 1950s. Cities carried the scars of bombing, and social divisions ran deep. Refugees like Alf were sometimes seen as outsiders, even after years of living in the country. But rather than withdraw, he leaned into the opportunities Britain provided. He studied, worked, and gradually carved out a space for himself. By the time Alf entered adulthood, he was determined to serve the society that had given him a second chance at life. He saw Britain not only as a place of refuge, but as a community that could be strengthened through compassion and justice. Politics, for him, was not about ambition, it was about duty. He had lived through the consequences of indifference and silence, and he believed that public service could be a way to make sure others would not be abandoned in their time of need. His path led him into the Labour Party, a political movement rooted in ideas of social equality and protection for the vulnerable. Alf believed deeply that government had a responsibility to shield those who could not shield themselves. It was not an abstract philosophy. It was written into his childhood, into the moment when strangers on the Kindertransport committee had chosen to save his life. Elected to Parliament in the 1970s, Alf Dubs became a voice for fairness and humanity. He worked on issues ranging from education to social services, always with an eye on those who stood at the margins. His speeches were not the fiery rhetoric of ambition, but the steady words of someone who understood the cost of neglect. In every policy debate, his childhood stood behind him like a shadow, reminding him of the stakes when governments choose to act or not to act. But Alf's career was not only about the past. He understood that history was alive, that the lessons of the 1930s and 1940s had to be applied to the crises of his own time. As the world faced new waves of refugees, Vietnamese boat people, victims of Balkan conflicts, later those fleeing wars in the Middle East, Alf recognized in them the faces of his younger self. Children with frightened eyes, parents making impossible choices, families torn apart by war. He knew their stories because he had lived one. In his political life, Alf often reminded colleagues and citizens alike that Britain had once chosen compassion. The Kindertransport was not perfect. It saved children, but left most parents behind. But it was a moral act, a choice to open doors instead of closing them. He urged Britain to remember that history, not as nostalgia, but as a guide for action. Even after leaving the House of Commons, Alf continued to serve. Appointed to the House of Lords, he used his position to champion refugee rights. His proposals often centered on children, unaccompanied minors stranded in camps, young people fleeing war zones with no protection. He argued that the wealth and safety of Britain gave it a duty to act, just as it had acted in 1939. His most famous campaign, the Dubs Amendment, sought to guarantee sanctuary for refugee children across Europe. This was not politics for popularity. It was the conviction of someone whose own survival had depended on the compassion of strangers. When Alf spoke of refugee children, he did not speak in abstract numbers. He spoke with the voice of a boy stepping off a train with a tag around his neck, clutching a suitcase that held the last traces of home. The transition from refugee child to political leader was not a straight path. It was marked by obstacles, doubts, and the lingering wounds of memory. But at its core, Alf's journey was proof of resilience, not just his own, but the resilience of a society that could be generous enough to save a child, and wise enough to allow that child to grow into one of its leaders. For Alf, adulthood was not a break from the past. It was a continuation of the responsibility handed to him on that train platform in Prague, to survive, to thrive, and to ensure that the humanity extended to him would be extended to others. In the corridors of Parliament, in the chambers of the House of Lords, and in the public debates of Britain, he carried with him the memory of the Kindertransport, transformed into action for the present. And so, the refugee boy, who once struggled to find his place in a foreign land, became a man who insisted that Britain always remember its role as a place of refuge. By the time Alf Dubs was elevated to the House of Lords in the 1990s, his story had already come full circle. The boy who once stepped off a Kindertransport train had become a lawmaker in the country that saved him. Yet instead of retiring quietly into history, Alf chose to keep fighting for those whose lives echoed his own childhood. The world was changing. Wars in the Balkans displaced hundreds of thousands. Genocide in Rwanda shocked consciences across continents. Later, conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Ukraine created waves of desperate families seeking safety. And in the middle of those crises, one group always seemed most vulnerable: the children. Alf recognized their faces. He had been one of them. When he read about unaccompanied minors stranded in makeshift camps, when he saw images of children huddled in boats or walking along highways, He saw himself at age 6, clutching a small suitcase, uncertain of what the future would hold. That empathy became action. In 2016, during the height of Europe's refugee crisis, Alf championed an amendment to Britain's immigration law that came to be known as the Dubs Amendment. Its aim was simple yet profound: to offer sanctuary in the United Kingdom to unaccompanied refugee children stranded in dangerous camps across Europe. The proposal drew on Britain's historic example during the Kindertransport, reminding the nation that it had once opened its doors when the world was closing them. The amendment sparked fierce debates. Some argued that Britain could not take in more people, that resources were stretched too thin, that responsibility lay elsewhere. But Alf countered with the calm certainty of lived experience. He reminded his colleagues that when Britain had taken in nearly 10,000 children before the Second World War, the country had been on the brink of conflict itself. If compassion was possible then, he argued, it was possible now. For Alf, it was not about numbers, it was about morality. If a country as rich as ours cannot offer sanctuary to children fleeing war, he said, then what does that say about who we are? His words carried the authority of someone who knew the difference that a single act of compassion could make. Though the amendment passed, its implementation was limited, and the government later closed the scheme after resettling far fewer children than campaigners had hoped. But even in disappointment, Alf continued to speak out. He travelled to refugee camps in Calais, met with children stranded in uncertainty, and brought their stories back to Britain's Parliament and media. He refused to let them become faceless statistics. He reminded the world that every child had a name, a story, and a right to safety. In doing so, Alf became more than a survivor of history. He became a living witness, connecting the past to the present. His advocacy made clear that the Kindertransport was not just a story to be told in museums. It was a call to action for every generation. The choices Britain made in 1939 still echoed, shaping how it responded to crises in the 21st century. Beyond legislation, Alf's presence in public life carried symbolic power. He often spoke at schools, universities, and memorial events, telling his story not to dwell on suffering, but to inspire responsibility. Young audiences listened to him as a reminder that history was not abstract. It lived in the memory of those who had endured it, and it demanded action in the present. At Holocaust memorial events, Alf would recall the moment of departure in Prague, the fear in his mother's eyes, and the uncertainty of arriving in Britain. He told these stories not to center himself, but to give weight to the voices of all Kindertransport children, many of whom had not lived to tell their own tales. In those moments, he spoke as one among thousands, a representative of survival. But Alf also knew that memory could not exist in isolation. It had to be linked to the world's ongoing crises. The lesson of the Kindertransport, he insisted, was not only about the past, it was about how societies respond when faced with children in danger today. His speeches returned again and again to this central theme. I was once one of them. I know what it means when a country says yes, and I know what it means when the world looks away. His activism in the 21st century did more than shape policies. It also challenged complacency. At a time when refugee debates were often framed in terms of fear and division, Alf offered a counter-narrative, one of humanity, responsibility, and memory. He reminded Britain that its strength lay not only in its armies or its economy, but in its capacity for compassion. In a sense, Alf Dubs became the embodiment of a circle completed. A child saved by strangers had grown into a man who fought to ensure that strangers would not be abandoned. His story bridged the gap between the civilians of 1939, who opened their homes, and the refugees of today, still searching for shelter. And yet, for all his political achievements, what resonated most deeply was the simplicity of his message. One child saved can change the world. History often risks being flattened into dates and numbers, wars measured by battles, losses recorded in columns of statistics, but sometimes one voice can cut through that noise and remind us that history is, above all, human. Alf Dubs. Journey from a frightened 6-year-old stepping off a train in London to a member of Britain's House of Lords is not simply a tale of survival. It is a testament to what happens when compassion overcomes fear. His life embodies both sides of the Kindertransport story, the vulnerability of those who needed saving and the courage of those who chose to act. By telling his story, Alf ensures that the Kindertransport is not remembered as a miracle without context. It was not magic. It was the result of ordinary men and women who chose to organize, to volunteer, to open their homes and their hearts. It was the result of a society that, at least in that moment, decided that saving children mattered more than closing borders. Without that decision, Alf Dubs would likely have been another name on a list of the lost. Instead, he became a voice for the living, and that voice continues to matter. As the decades pass, the number of living Kindertransport survivors grows fewer. The day will come when no child of those trains remains to tell the story in their own words. That reality gives urgency to Alf's mission, to make sure memory does not fade into silence, and to connect that memory to the choices we face now. When he speaks to young people, he often shares a simple reflection. I was lucky. Luck is not a policy. It is not something to which children in danger should be left. Those words carry a quiet power, because they strip away excuses and political calculations. They reduce everything to a fundamental truth. Children should not have to rely on luck to survive. Alf's advocacy also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What does it say about us if a country in 1939, facing war, food shortages and bombardment, could still open its doors, yet in today's world of relative peace and prosperity, we hesitate? What does it mean when the memory of generosity is celebrated in history books, but not always imitated in practice? The story of Alf Dubs reminds us that history is not only about what happened, but about what could happen again, both the tragedies and the triumphs. The same forces that created the need for the Kindertransport, fear, prejudice, violence, still exist, but so do the forces that made it possible, empathy, courage, and the willingness of ordinary people to act. In his later years, Alf often reflected on the faces of those who greeted him when he arrived in Britain. He remembered their kindness, the warmth of strangers who would never know how much their welcome mattered. That memory became the anchor of his life's work. For Alf, the past was not a closed chapter. It was a constant responsibility. And so, the Kindertransport lives on, not only in museums or memorials, but in the choices societies make when confronted with displaced children today. It lives on every time a community decides to host a refugee family, every time a government enacts laws that protect the vulnerable, every time an individual looks at a frightened child and chooses empathy over indifference. Alf Dubs's life tells us that the legacy of rescue is not static. It demands renewal. Just as Nicholas Winton could not have saved hundreds of children without allies, Alf's call to compassion cannot succeed without others answering it. The story does not belong to one man or one generation. It belongs to all of us. As we reflect on his journey, one image lingers: a small boy standing on a platform in Prague, holding his mother's hand for the last time, stepping onto a train that would save his life. That boy grew into a man who spent his years making sure the world never forgot what was at stake in that moment. The Kindertransport saved a child. That child grew into a witness. That witness became a defender of the next generation. And that is the lesson Alf Dubs leaves us with. When we choose to act with compassion, the effects ripple outward in ways we cannot imagine. A single life saved can become a voice that speaks for millions. History is not only what we inherit, it is what we choose to do with that inheritance.